Welcome to On the Prowl. Do the Florida Panthers need fixing? Episode 16. Have very special guest TJ from Panthers Pourri today. TJ, welcome. Thank you for stopping by today. Appreciate it.
Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
You guys do a great job with your podcast. I do check out all the podcasts for the Panthers, and everybody does a great job. Different takes on things, which is great, and it's always good to listen to everybody and to see what they have to go.
Shout out to everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a great game the other night. It was probably one of the more complete games that we saw from start to finish. I mean, from the time the puck dropped against the Leafs until the final horn, they were in that game 100%. No questions asked. I mean, everybody, everybody was dialed in that game. And even, and I know some people, and one of the things I've been getting a lot of feedback on, and that's probably the first question I'm going to ask you, is Matthew Tkachuck. He just has not seemed himself because, when he's himself, he's agitating goalies. He's after a clean dump in, he'll hit somebody pretty hard. He's stirring up the pot, and really haven't seen a lot of that this season. So I guess that's one of the first questions I wanted to ask you. Is that injury that he had from previous year, is that still kind of lingering, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that was from the Vegas series. I mean, that was a thing that we were talking about on the podcast and just in general on Twitter last year, because he got off to a slow start, it seemed like. And I'm pretty sure that I said something on the account that went along the lines of, when Tkachuck gets it going, the Panthers will be the best team in the league. And somewhere in like mid-November, right around the time of the year that we are in now, they went from like 500 to the rest of the way they were one of the best teams in the league, and they continued that going into the playoffs. I mean, with Tkachuck, because of how physical he plays, you could always wonder about, did he bang up something here or there? Again, like last season, he did get off to a slow start. I mean, Tkachuck is a gamer. You and I both know that. So he understands, like we understand, that, it's a long season. It's a grind. And what you do in April, May, and June is going to matter 100 times more than what you do in November, December, as far as how your season gets remembered. And maybe that means that he's pacing himself now. I mean, you would never think that Tkachuck's a guy that's going to take a night off, but at the same time, he probably understands that, like, I need to put our team in the best position to reach the goal that we want to reach. And the goal isn't the President's Trophy, as nice as it is to win that. The goal is to win the Stanley Cup. And you want to have home ice. You want to win as many games as you can to get home ice. It mattered last year in Game 7 that it was on home ice. But they proved that they didn't need home ice to get to the Stanley Cup final in 2023. So you could go either way. You could say, they got to play hard now. They got to get home ice because it matters a lot. We saw it last year. You could also say 2023, they didn't need home ice. The reason that they lost the Stanley Cup final didn't have to do with having home ice. So you could go either way on it. As far as Tkachuck goes, like, we'll have to see how the rest of the season goes, because other guys are picking up the slack. And like the games that they lost in this most recent streak, you could definitely say, well, look, they scored 1 goal against the Blackhawks. They scored 1 goal against the Capitals. Scoring, they need the scorers to show up. And Tkachuck is one of those guys that we haven't necessarily seen chip in. You can't really say like, oh, Sam Reinhart's not pulling his weight as far as scoring goals. He leads the NHL in goals. Sasha Barkov, since coming back from injury, he's been fantastic as well. But yeah, Tkachuck could be one of those guys you point to on a night where you lose 3-1 and say, hey, like, we needed a couple of points from you tonight, maybe.
That's a great analysis, TJ. One of the other things, during this streak that we've had recently, and Paul was really good, because I saw in an interview, and I don't know who did the interview with him, was a post game, and he talked about, he said, oh, last year our losing streak, we were poorer last year than we were this year. And I think a lot of people, and a lot of what I've heard in terms of comments and talk and things, is a lot of people have pointed to the defense for the Panthers, and specifically, Aaron Ekblad. Now, Aaron Ekblad, I'm going to say this. I've always been a fan of his. And I think one of the things that when OEL and Montour obviously left us, it left a gap there. There's no question. And a lot of people feel like Ekblad was asked to pick up both of those players, which we both know is impossible, and he can't do that. For me personally, and I just wanted to get your take on this. I've seen a decline in Ekblad in terms of his offensive production, but I think his defensive skills are still there. I don't see any degradation as far as that's concerned. However, one of the things, and I forget which game it was, but he had a zero that game. He wasn't a plus or a minus. He had a zero that game. But I saw him get caught a few times up ice because he had pinched a couple of times. And I noticed he was having a hard time getting back into play. In other words, I think his speed wasn't there. What are your thoughts about the whole defensive situation and specifically with Ekblad?
Yeah, I mean, the subtitle of the show is "Do the Panthers Need Fixing?" And I mean, that's probably the area that I look at in particular, like offense being generated from the blue line. And you said it all when you were talking about OEL's not here anymore, Montour's not here anymore. OEL's offense wasn't a huge part of the playoff run, but it was pretty critical in getting them that home ice that I talked about. Montour's offense was critical the entire time that he was in Florida, basically, but definitely the last year, definitely the last 2 years. And Ekblad's now the guy that they're looking at to be the power play one quarterback, which I think is kind of an interesting decision, given that he's already being asked to do so much at 5-on-5. And I don't know what you thought, but I thought Uvis Balinskis was a pretty effective power play quarterback. I think you can definitely take some qualms with other things in his game. 5-on-5 defensively, getting the puck out of the D zone. I thought he was struggling with a little bit here and there, but it's not something I've watched extensive film on, to be completely honest. As far as Ekblad goes, he's coming off his best game of the season, in my opinion. I thought he was really good against the Leafs. But, he's a flawed player right now. There's some things that he absolutely excels at, but his speed is like, for first pairing defenseman in the NHL, I'd be surprised if he wasn't one of the 5 slowest of those, 64 defensemen, I guess, at this point, because that's never really been his game, but also like all the injuries are catching up. And he's going to be a guy that's going to have a 36-year-old NHL player body in when he's 31 in a couple of years. So that's something to monitor as far as Aaron Ekblad's long-term future. As far as right now, again, he's coming off a great game. I thought he was really good against the Leafs. A lot of the time when they give up a bad goal, like a transition goal, he's partially culpable. So in games that they lose, people are going to be looking at him. But games that they win, like that game last night, or a couple nights ago at this point, some of the things that he's doing, the Leafs only scored 1 goal, and partially attribute that to Ekblad playing very good defensively. So the things that he does well oftentimes won't get noticed on the defensive side, but offensively, I thought he was really good in that game. So if they continue to lose, I think it will continue to be a talking point, but the season has gone pretty well so far. They're in an okay position. And if they continue to play like they did in the 4-game losing streak, I think Ekblad will be a part of it. And I think if they get back on track, I think he'll be a part of it too. So really, that's one of those key linchpin players for them. You're not surprised if Barkov has a great game in a game that they lose. But I have a feeling that if Ekblad plays poorly, they're probably not going to win. But if Ekblad plays well, it's probably hard to beat them. Where's the weak link in the team then? So yeah, that's interesting to look at, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. That's great, TJ. Because a lot of people that I heard of, and I read everywhere. I read everything on the Panthers every day. And one of the things people were like, oh, Zito needs to pull the trigger. He needs to do something here. And then I reminded people of something. I'm like, look at where we were last year at this time. And the record, they were almost identical in terms of the record last year and the general, where things were. And one of the things I heard Paul say, and he said this several times, is he said, you know what? I don't even look at the standings until after New Year's. Okay. He said, I don't pay attention to any of that. And I think in the same sentence or in the same conversation, he also said, remember, the season is a marathon. It's not a sprint. He says, it's not how you start out. It's always about how you finish. And you want to finish strong, obviously, in April to make sure you make that push to get the points, like you said, to be able to have home ice during most of the playoffs, which I think, the President's Trophy, forget, get those points, get that home ice. And we saw how important that was in the playoffs. Okay. Zito needs to pull the trigger again. Zito needs to do this. Zito needs to do that. TJ, I don't think I've been following hockey since 1972. I don't think I've ever seen a better general manager for a hockey team ever than Bill Zito. He is so dialed in to the team. He's dialed into Paul's style. He knows what works. He knows what doesn't work. And all these armchair general managers wanting to pull all these trades right now for, say, another elite defenseman, and they don't even give a second thought to it. And he has his pulse on the team. What are your thoughts about them, trying to pick up somebody at this point in time? Because I think it's totally ludicrous. What are your thoughts about that?
I'm with you. The idea that they can add pieces, I don't think is far-fetched, especially this year compared to last, where if you looked at the team last year, there just weren't a lot of flaws. This year, I mean, the depth scoring one was one they pointed at. They went and got Tarasenko, and he scored key goals for them. So that was another great move by Bill Zito. I think you could point to that again this year. And like I said, there's a hole as far as offense from the blue line, but everybody in the league wants a top 4 defenseman right now. I don't think there's any team that if all of a sudden a top 4 defenseman came available for pennies on the dollar, they would not take the phone call. Every team in the league is always looking for good defensemen. That's not to say that oh, we can't talk about the Panthers wanting good defensemen because that's just, a given. That's just saying, would you like $100 free or something like that? Because they have a particular need for, a solution as far as generating offense from the blue line. But it's something that they're just way better suited to deal with at the trade deadline when, all of a sudden the prices drop. People are going to be eager to get rid of their pending unrestricted free agents, especially if they're not a competitive team. They're looking to get a better draft pick rather than a better playoff seed. And that's when you can get somebody like a Tarasenko for pennies on the dollar. I don't know who this year's Tarasenko is going to be. It might not be a scoring winger. It might be a defenseman that is in the mold of a Montour that can be the power play quarterback and add that offense from the blue line. And I would look for them to do something around February or March rather than do it now, because I don't really think that there's in a position where the foundation is about to crumble. Like you said, Zito is, very well plugged into how his team is doing. And he should be able to look at the results of the season and say, we're in a good position right now. We don't need to panic. And I mean, even if they were in 6th in the division, I don't think that Zito would be the kind to panic. And all of a sudden we're trading 2 first-round picks for the next Ben Sherratt. I don't think he would do something like that. He learned from his mistake. And that was, I don't know, his 2nd or 3rd year as a general manager where he made that move. And I mean, it was obviously a bad move, but it's not one that he should, be hung out for. It's not one that we should necessarily bring up all the time. But that's to say, this is the kind of overreaction that you can make if you see a problem that's not necessarily there. He learned from it, and I doubt they're going to be making that move, especially in November. I don't think they're going to be making it in March either, but they'll be shrewd, and the best time to be shrewd is around the trade deadline when the prices drop. And the cap space is also an issue. Somebody's got to go out if they want to add a player that's making NHL salary, unless it's going to get 50% retained and it's a very low amount. So, I mean, what salary are you moving out? I mean, maybe Spencer Knight, but I don't know what you do at backup goalie if you do that. And I don't know if you would want to give up on Spencer Knight at this point. He's had 2 pretty good games in a row in his past 2. That's another thing to consider. They couldn't just flip 2 first-round picks for Alex Pietrangelo if he was all of a sudden available. The cap space would be an issue as well.
Well, and you brought up Spencer Knight, and that's a great point, because I wanted to ask you about him, and I agree. Those 2 games, people are too quick, I think, to judge him based upon the play of the team. When a team plays well in front of a goaltender, it boisters them. I mean, some of Bob's best games, the defense, they're blocking shots, they're sticks in the lane, that kind of thing. They're doing everything they can to help their goaltender out. And and I noticed, for the most part, the other night was when Spencer played, they were doing the same thing for him. I mean, we didn't get a win out of that, but I thought he played very well. Long term, do you see him as the backup for now for Bobrovsky?
Yeah, like the thing about that is I don't really think it comes down to his ability unless we see him just fall off a cliff. It's like I was saying about the cap space. If they have big plans that they need to facilitate, like opening cap space for, that's the logical place to do it. And they have to ask themselves, like, where do we see it going with Knight? Personally, if I had to handicap it, I would not feel like Knight is the number one goalie of the future, and like they shouldn't proceed thinking that like when Bob is no longer as effective as he is right now, Spencer will walk in and he'll be exactly as effective. That can't be taken for granted. If they decide to go that route just because it's very difficult to get a goaltender that's as good as Bobrovsky and like the cap space is just going to be better allocated elsewhere, that will make sense to me. But the question really is that, like, do they need that cap space? And right now, I don't think they need it, but they may decide that they do in the future. If somebody gets an injury, they're not just going to punt on this season. They want to go back to back while they still have Tkachuck in his mid-20s, Barkov in his early 30s, Bob still playing like Bob. Last year he was one of the biggest reasons they won the cup. They're going to want to capitalize on this window. So let's say, Sam Bennett is out for the playoffs. All of a sudden they might feel like they need to go out and get the best center on the market, and Spencer Knight's cap might be a necessary casualty of that. I would be curious if you see it the same way, or if you think it's more about how well he plays down the stretch.
I agree with you about cap space, and I think that's so important because that's part of the conversation. A lot of people talked about Bill Zito's been re-signing Carter Verhaeghe, all total surprise. Usually you don't see this with teams this early on in a season where you're re-signing these players, but Bill Zito's from a different breed, okay, and he's done some of these things, and it's great. Verhaeghe, I think he'll get better as the season progresses.
Yes,
I am not worried about him at all. But I think the conversation about Sam Bennett and the whole thing with salary cap, I mean, you brought up a great point with like Spencer Knight as far as that's concerned. A lot of people are like, because there was talk that Zito was gonna sign Bennett, okay, and get him locked up. When but cap space right now is fairly kind of as far as that's concerned. So whether he does that or not, I don't think Zito's going to do that right now in terms of locking Bennett up, but I think he will. What are your thoughts about that? Do you see him re-signing Bennett for multi years like the rest of the core?
I do. I ultimately think that will happen. And it's interesting. Usually there's one or two casualties of this kind of situation, like Brandon Saad in Chicago. He ended up getting traded to Columbus, and they undid that in that disastrous Panarin trade. But, that's beside the point. You just don't typically see these teams keep together all their guys. But Bill Zito, I feel like he's really bought into the group of players that he's kept, especially, we saw him get rid of the guys that he wasn't 100% bought in on, and to bring in Matthew Tkachuk. And like, it would be nice to have Mackenzie Weegar back right now, but obviously that move paid immense dividends, and, not re-signing Jonathan Huberdeau and trading him instead was one of the best decisions that any NHL general manager has ever made. But I do think that he's got a group of guys now that he's really bought into. I mean, these are his guys, like Carter Verhaeghe, brought in by Bill Zito. Sam Bennett, brought in by Bill Zito. Matthew Tkachuk, brought in by Bill Zito. Gustav Forsling, brought in by Bill Zito. And these are guys that he has locked up since. So like there's that general manager like tie to the player. They're going to feel like that's their guy. They want to keep that guy around. But, the salary cap going up at the exact moment that's going up is just put them in an environment where doing this makes so much sense. And the announcement didn't come, like the idea of how high it was going to go didn't come until a lot of these guys locked up their extensions. We saw, the Verhaeghe extension before we really had an idea of what the cap was going to be. The Reinhardt extension, which just looks like an absolute steal for a guy that's a Selke contender and the top goal scorer in the NHL. Just a crazy combination of abilities for a guy that's not even making 10 million when so many players in this league make 10 million. And Bennett, I think he's going to be able to stay under the cap when the cap goes up. And he's probably going to take another team-friendly discount with the lack of income tax in Florida and the fact that this is just a great place to be, not only as hockey players, but as individuals. They want to be in the sun. They want to be able to go fishing, go out on the boat, go to the beach. And also, the world-class music venues, restaurants, nightclubs, et cetera. All South Florida has it all. They don't want to leave. And they can win while they're here. I mean, you'll take a discount to do that, especially when you save money on like the private jet fuel, because you don't have to fly somewhere else to go to the restaurants, nightclubs, beaches, boating, whatever you want to do. You can do it all here. So it makes a lot of sense for him to stay. It obviously makes sense for the Panthers to keep him. It's not like that fall off is imminent. He's still in his 20s, I believe. So it makes a lot of sense for the Panthers to keep him. It makes sense for him to stay. I just see it happening. It just seems logical.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%, TJ. And I had on, and I've talked to all the beat reporters for the Panthers, and they're all great. And one of them said, this one really stuck with me, about why these players, why they want to play here, and there's several reasons. One, they really like Maurice. They really buy into him. They really like his style and how he approaches things with them. You talked about the no income tax, which is kind of a no-brainer in the state of Florida. One of the other things with that too is, the locker room. And one of the beat reporters said they have such a tight, close-knit locker room, like you wouldn't believe. He says it's very different from a lot of other locker rooms where there's some contentiousness and some, selfish play and things like that. That's one thing I would have to say about the Panthers is they really are one of the most selfless teams out there. Okay. Where, and a great example the other night, okay, during that shorthanded goal that Reinhardt scored, Sasha could have shot that. It was very easy for him. No, he passes it to Reinhardt. I mean, they're so good about that. And I think one of the other things, in line with that, and this is what I wanted to get your take on is, and this is another key reason why a lot of them like to stay here. We're a small market, okay? We're not a Toronto. We're not a New York. We're not a Chicago. We're not a Los Angeles. So and you have these great reporters, okay? And I've interviewed them all. These guys are fantastic, okay? They're not in your face like these reporters are in New York or in Toronto, and like they're really good. What's your take on that? I mean, because it's such a great combination of things. Why not play here? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, it's like the perfect size, I think, because at this point, I don't think the players are going to be like, well, nobody gives a crap about the Florida Panthers because they know how loud the building is, how full it is. Even, the infamous Tuesday night against Ottawa, as George Richards loves to say, is now a game that 18,000 people are going to be at. And I think that that's going to be the case for the next few years. They might be a 500 team, and I still feel like if people are going to be watching Barkov, Reinhardt, Tkachuk, they're going to pay to go see the team again on a Tuesday night in Ottawa. And at the same time, there's still not that like press that like is going to get a million clicks if they find Tkachuk at the Elbow Room on a Friday night. That's not a story in South Florida. People are too busy dissecting Tua's performance the previous night or whatever. It's a football market. It's a Miami Heat market. And now it's a Panthers market. But even with the success that they've had, I think with truth serum, all of the sports media would say, like, we're happy to be number 3 in the pecking order. And with the success of Hurricanes football this season, maybe even number 4. But like, that's fine because all those people are still going to be around and they're still going to win the Stanley Cup, even being like not number 1 in the pecking order. And really, the only places that hockey is number 1 in the NHL right now are the Canadian markets. And some of them you could argue football is even bigger there. Canadian football, probably not the league itself, but like football might be the biggest sport in some of the markets, like the Western and the Central markets, especially. But, you know, in the United States, football's king, basketball's probably number 2. And then depending on the market, hockey might be number 3, number 4, maybe even 5 or 6. In South Florida right now, we've gotten it up to number 3, and that's great. And that's probably a perfect place for a hockey player to be, in all honesty. They don't want to be the number 1 thing because imagine all the Twitter stuff you see, unless you just make an effort. I'm talking to you specifically. Unless you make an effort to avoid this altogether, you've probably seen 100 to 1,000 different opinions about how well Tua played last night. Imagine being Tua and having to deal with everybody having an opinion on you, some of them being negative, and just the pressure that puts on you on a daily basis. Hockey players don't have to deal with that in this market. So you're right. It's an ideal combination. It's an ideal medium. They're not going to be irrelevant. It's not going to be, 8,000 people in the stands for a big game, but they're going to be able to keep the peace. They're going to be able to enjoy their lives when the hockey game isn't going on.
And this kind of leads me to one of my final questions here. And I get this asked a lot of me. And do you see them repeating as Stanley Cup champions? And how I like to phrase it is this, and how I'll approach this question is this way to you, TJ, is do you see the pieces in place for them poised to be able to make a deep Stanley Cup playoff run this year?
I feel like what you're asking, I would say yes to. I'm including the pieces for my argument, some of them being like the assets that they'll need to make a trade at the deadline. Because I think the people who are saying that they probably need to make a move aren't wrong. What they're wrong about is that when they need to do it, and they're going to make a trade at the deadline. I mean, last year we were saying we don't even know, this team's going so well. They still made a move at the deadline. Every contender did. You very rarely see a trade deadline go past where a contender doesn't make a move. So in reality, it's, safe as death. You got to try to make your team better at all times at any given opportunity. You don't want to do it like this part of the year, though, because, you have finite assets. You want to be able to spend them at the deadline so that you get the maximum return, because that's just when you're going to be able to get the best players for the best deals. So they're in position to make that move. If you're just asking me point blank, are they going to repeat? It's more likely than that they're not going to, just because there's going to be 16 teams in the playoffs, and hockey's a very random sport. The best team often doesn't win. In my opinion, last year it did, but often the best team doesn't win. And there's going to be a lot of good teams that are going to go up against, and maybe a goalie gets hot and all of a sudden they somehow lose a series. Like we saw last year in that Boston series. Boston was just so inferior in terms of the skater group. The skater talent was just so much worse. But they were competitive in that series because of how good Swayman was, and a few good bounces in some of the games. That could happen in a series with a team that's far more talented in terms of the skater group than Boston, and all of a sudden the Panthers might be the better team, but they didn't play better, or they just didn't get the bounces, and all of a sudden they find themselves getting eliminated. Unfortunately, that's just more likely than not. But they're going to be one of the strongest contenders for the title. I would say the Eastern Conference, there's not a team I would put above them as far as favorites for the Cup. But it's hard to repeat. You've got the full grind of the previous year's run on your legs. And let's not forget 2 years ago, they also played the more games than anybody else. So it's going to be challenging. And with that in mind, it's less likely than likely that they'll repeat, but they're, in a perfectly good position. Like you said, I don't remember the exact phrasing, but all the pieces are in place, I think is what you said. I would agree with that.
Right. Kind of want to wrap up with this here. Making a deep playoff run is so key. And like you said, a bounce here, a hot goalie here, can make the difference. Okay. And they seem to have that. What I'm hoping for during that March deadline, during that trade deadline, is that we can get somebody, and I hate to pick him out as an example as Tarasenko, because he was such a key ingredient for them for last season. And I know if somebody like that is available and Zito comes calling, he's going to get him. Okay.
Yeah.
He'll get him, and it might be that piece that will push them over for this year. And I had a talk with Rod Peterson from Cats and Bolts podcast, and we talked about repeating as Stanley Cup champions. And I said, other than the Bolts with the COVID and the bubble stuff, what I consider the last real repeat was 16 and 17 when the Penguins did. And like you said, it is so, in this sport more than any others, it's so difficult because, if you want a chance at luck or a streak or something or other, you see it happen, and you see repeats happen like in baseball or in the NBA or in the NFL, because a team is just so strong and can dominate like that. But in hockey, it's different. What I'm hoping for is that Zito, come that March deadline, can be able to get somebody like a Tarasenko on board that's gonna light the scoreboard up. It's gonna infuse everybody. And because, when something like that happens, the whole rest of the team just rises up and meets that. What are your thoughts about something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, like, if they need as big of a name as Tarasenko. That was just like a great opportunity. Like the price was so low to get somebody as talented as him. And if that opportunity comes up again, and it very well could, because of what I was talking about, of how this is just such an attractive market for players now to play in, that they're some of these guys are going to tell their GMs, like, look, that's where I want to go. And even if they don't have the no movement clause that Tarasenko did that forced Ottawa's hand, it could be a situation like with Kyle Okposo, where the general manager has such respect for the player that they're doing right by him. And, it sends a message around the league that, like, this is a place where, even if it doesn't work out, the general manager will have your best interests in mind. So a lot of the time that does lead to the player getting their way, even if they don't have 100% leverage. And that situation very well could happen again. It's difficult to predict who exactly will be available. I have very little idea of what teams are going to be selling from the Eastern Conference, especially at the deadline. It really just feels like we can lock in Montreal and Columbus, and that's it as far as sellers go. Everybody else could go on a 3-game winning streak, and all of a sudden they feel like they're a playoff contender because that 8 seed is just readily available this year. There are 7 teams that I feel like are doing pretty awesome right now. The Panthers are one of them. And then that 8 seed could be the Sabres. It could be the Senators. It could be the Red Wings. It could be the Bruins. It could be, a couple of other teams, Islanders. So who knows if these teams are going to be sellers? And we don't know what players might be available from them, but maybe one of them has a 5-game losing streak, and all of a sudden the Panthers have a great opportunity to add somebody for a 3rd and a 4th. And if they got to add somebody, though, I will go back to what I said. This team right now, the 20 guys, I'm not feeling like that's a Stanley Cup favorite. And when they add maybe one depth winger and probably a second pairing defenseman that has more of an offensive tilt to their game, then they might be able to make some noise as serious as they have in the past couple of seasons.
That's an excellent point to close on, TJ. Getting that offensive minded player, and I use Tarasenko just as an example for that. Obviously, you really kind of hit the nail on the head for me. I still see them, as being strong, but again, I also see Bill Zito doing something at the trade deadline to bolster the team, because he's pretty much been given a blank check from the Violas and saying, look, do what you need to do to get us to that level. And, everything about this team is just, it's a reason that they're my favorite team. Obviously, I live in Tampa, but they're a reason that they're my favorite team. It starts with ownership. It goes to the general manager, it goes to the head coach, and it goes to the player. I mean, everybody is on the same page, and I believe they'll get there. I really do. I just haven't.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen them get there. They did it. We know they can get there. We seeing is believing.
Exactly. TJ, thank you so much. I want to thank everybody for stopping by to watch Florida Panthers Den on the Prowl today with special guest TJ from Panthers Pourri. There's going to be a link in the description so you guys can check out their podcast. Please do. They do a great job. You know, all the Panthers podcasts are great, and I highly recommend them all. Definitely want to check them out. As always, it's a great day for Florida Panthers hockey. Time to hunt.